Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Bounce Back podcast by Robert. Today is another day, another Saturday, where we discuss about real issues affecting our nation, our continent, and the world. Today is yet another day for another episode, and we would like to discuss a very, very important topic. Again, just like the State House budget last week, this one touches close to the presidency. And the topic of our discussion today regards presidential impeachment. We would like to know, in a manner, how do presidential impeachments happen? If a president was to be impeached in Kenya, what would happen? What would be expected? And how would that happen? My opinion is based on governance and strategy. I am a policy, strategy, and development plus governance consultant expert, and I want to give my opinion based on those parameters. I'm not a lawyer, and this is not going to be probably a law-based discussion. So the legal consequences, political arithmetic, and state stability in the hypothetical impeachment of President William Ruto. Of course, this is a hypothetical scene. It is not something that is happening, or I'm not in any way saying that it is something that would happen, but we are giving a hypothetical situation. What would happen in the unlikely or likely impeachment of a president? So what happens when the highest office in Kenya becomes constitutionally vulnerable? Can a sitting president actually be removed? What numbers would Parliament require? How fast could it happen? And if it did, would Kenya's constitutional order be messed up? And would the nation face instability? Tonight we examine one of the most serious governance questions in modern Kenya. If a president falls, what happens next? So we are going to look into 8 parameters, 8 points that will help us explain this issue on presidential impeachment. And these 8 points will help us to see how a hypothetical scenario would be if President William Ruto was impeached. The legal, constitutional, governance, political, and policy situations or parameters. So, the first point is the Kenya's constitutional framework. Kenya's Constitution of 2010, under Article 145, provides a clear legal mechanism for removing a sitting president. And what is the threshold? First of all, it would require 117 members of parliament to initiate the impeachment. That means they would have to come up with the articles of impeachment, the issues that are being brought on the floor of the House that require discussion towards the impeaching of a president. So these 117 would come up with the articles, and then they would approve the articles in a committee of parliament, and then it would be brought to the floor of the House. After that, it would require 233 members of parliament in the National Assembly to impeach a president. On top of that, the vote will go to the Senate, and it would require 45 senators to convict a president in the Senate. The legal grounds would come from between gross violation of the Constitution, serious crimes against the nation, and gross misconduct, including issues of illegality, where members of parliament would feel that the president has violated the Constitution, thereby requiring an impeachment. For example, the impeachment of Governor Mike Sonko in 2020 and Ferdinand Waititu in 2020 also demonstrate that the constitutional removal or the mechanism of impeaching of a president are functional. and thereby possible. Also, Kenya has so far impeached a deputy president. The first deputy president under President William Ruto was impeached successfully by Parliament, and the vote stood in Senate, and the deputy president stood impeached. Point two, the global examples on how presidents actually fall. We want to also look at other jurisdictions, other countries, and see how impeachment has happened there and how successful these impeachments were in those countries, and therefore try and also mirror and see if there was a successful impeachment of a president in our country, how would that happen? Thereby, we will look at the United States about the impeachment or the trial and the supposition of an impeachment of presidents. 3 presidents have faced impeachment. 1 resigned. 1 was successfully impeached but was saved by the Senate. Another one was also impeached and successfully saved by the Senate. In 1974, President Richard Nixon faced impeachment and he opted to resign. And in that 1974, he resigned before removal or formal removal from office during the Watergate scandal, the famous Watergate scandal, because of abuse of power, obstruction of justice, and his Republican support collapsed. So he decided to resign before the impeachment vote was done. It is important to realize that when political support collapses, resignation is normally important, because when you as a leader, if your party and you fail to get support from your own party, or if your own party has a minority, then you opt to resign to save your face, to avoid the shame that comes with impeachment. And this is what happened with President Richard Nixon in 1974. Fast forward to 1998, in December, President Bill Clinton was also impeached during the famous Monica Lewinsky scandal. And during this impeachment, the charges that were brought upon him included perjury and obstruction of justice. The House impeached him, but the Senate failed to secure a conviction that would send him home. So in 1998, a president was impeached in the United States, President Bill Clinton, and the House impeached him, but the Senate saved him. Also, in 2019 and in 2021, President Donald Trump, the current president of the United States, was also impeached, and he was twice impeached and twice acquitted. His charges included abuse of power, incitement allegations, but the Senate acquitted him. This also means, therefore, the lessons that we get out of this is that strong party loyalty can override impeachment efforts. If you have many senators in the Senate that are supporting you, that are supporting your presidency, and the House votes, because it's a bicameral system just like ours, and the House decides to impeach you, the Senate can save you. In Brazil, President Dilma Rousseff was successfully impeached in 2016, and he was removed through the collapse of her coalition because of fiscal misconduct allegations. Parliamentary alliances fractured, and the Senate convicted her. The vice president, therefore, assumed office in the wake of that impeachment. Another lesson is this, or another scenario: when a governing coalition, your governing coalition collapses, the parties that form that coalition withdraw support for you, then an impeachment is possible. In 2017, in South Korea, President Park Geun-hye was also removed from office through institutional and public pressure. Her charges were a corruption scandal. There were massive citizens' protests, and Parliament voted to impeach her. The Constitutional Court, after the impeachment, she went to court, and the Constitutional Court upheld that removal and she stood impeached. The lesson also here is that public pressure plus institutional independence can accelerate executive accountability that can lead to you being removed from office and you being impeached. Finally, closer to home, in 2018, President Jacob Zuma of South Africa resigned under impeachment pressure. Why? There were multiple corruption scandals or allegations, growing internal ANC rebellion. ANC is the majority party in South Africa. And then impeachment pressure intensified. He decided to resign before formal removal. What is the lesson? Impeachment can function as strategic political leverage even without final parliamentary execution, meaning you can face a lot of political pressure, a lot of parliamentary pressure. Your colleagues, people you've appointed, your government, members within and outside can gang up together, come against you, and force you with a certain political pressure to just resign rather than facing the shame of impeachment. That was point 2 about the examples, global examples about impeachment. And we've seen how other countries have conducted impeachment, including the United States, Brazil, South Korea, and South Africa. So number 3, question is, what could trigger impeachment in Kenya? If President William Ruto was to be impeached today, what would have triggered that impeachment? Number 1, gross constitutional violations, major corruption scandal, criminal misconduct, severe abuse of office, and a practical example of this would be a large-scale constitutional scandal or corruption crisis that could act as a trigger, much like the Watergate scandal of the USA back in 1974. Or the Rufuos fiscal crisis in Brazil, or the PAC corruption scandal in South Korea. These are strategic realities that can force a president to be impeached. For example, our current serving president has been preferred to the International Criminal Court, and he was indicted there, and the trial proceeded, but later on it failed. We do not know whether he was acquitted or if the case remains active, but such is an example of something that can push a president or our president to be impeached. When you're indicted in an international court like the International Criminal Court, that is a gross violation of constitutional order on ethics that is on chapter 6 about the conduct of a president. Right? So these are some of the factors: corruption, gross violation of the constitution, gross issues legal issues that come upon you as a president could force you to be impeached. Point number 4. How fast is a presidential impeachment exercise in Kenya? From the beginning of the preferring of charges to the indeed impeachment vote, how long does it take and what happens in every step? That is what we're going to look at next. So the estimated process is between 0 and 60 days from the event that triggers the impeachment, evidence gathering, coalition negotiations, up until the end and the impeachment happens. So from day 0 to day 6, we talk about an event has been triggered, evidence has been adduced, the coalition has sat down, and the articles of impeachment have been drawn up. The 117 members of parliament have sat down and have presented to the House the intention to impeach. That can happen between the first week. Day 7 and to day 14, the National Assembly votes to impeach. That means on that second week, the National Assembly, now the other members of parliament, vote on the impeachment vote of a president. And if it passes, between day 15 and 28, the case is referred to the Senate of Kenya, and the discussions also happen, and a trial actually happens where the president who is facing impeachment is given an opportunity to defend himself against the charges that have been preferred upon him, to speak and to offer his defense. And much like a court trial, this is what now happens on between the 15th and the 28th day. Then on the 28th day, the Senate will vote, and if 45 senators vote to impeach, then that president stands fired, stands impeached. He cannot serve in office. That happens on the 29th day. After that, then they become an immediate succession to the office of the president. To the deputy president of the impeached president continues with service to the nation till the date of the next election. In this case, therefore, Deputy President Professor Kithure Kindiki would have to take up the running of government, and he becomes president till we vote again, till the next election. The reason why it is done like this is that government cannot stand in a vacuum. The presidency cannot exist in a vacuum. The executive authority cannot be vested in anybody else other than the president of a nation, and is also the commander-in-chief of the Kenya Defense Forces. So it is important that that position is filled, and according to the constitution, it is the deputy president who takes over the leadership of the government up until the next election. So, a practical example. Once formally initiated, Kenya could remove a president in approximately 30 to 45 to 60 days. The Kenya's constitutional design prioritizes continuity of government while preserving accountability of the office of the president. So point number 5, who takes over? Already we've conversed through that one, and we've seen that the deputy president takes over office immediately. So if William Ruto were to be removed through impeachment, I'm not saying that he's being removed. I'm not saying that there's a vote that is happening. I'm not saying that an impeachment proceeding is ongoing. No, but in the scenario that he was to be impeached, Professor Kithure Kindiki automatically becomes president. And the comparative example is this. In 1974, after President Nixon opted to resign because of impeachment, Gerald Ford, who was the vice president at that time, took over after Nixon and continued to run government up until the next election. After Rousseff, Michel Temer took over the running of the Brazilian government after the president Rousseff was impeached. And what is the significance of this? This prevents executive vacuum. Like I've said, the office of the president cannot exist in a vacuum, and this is done to prevent that, because the presidency cannot exist in a vacuum. Number 2, the security instability. The president is the commander-in-chief of the Kenya Defense Forces. The president is the symbol of authority in this nation. The president is the titular head of government. The president is the symbol of national unity. And the president is the cohesive glue that puts Kenya together. Also, the president is the chief principal individual that negotiates for Kenya in other countries and is the one who's authorized to make decisions on behalf of us as Kenyans. We've given executive authority through him, through electing him as our president to represent the aspirations of our Republic, Kenya. Therefore, that office cannot exist in a vacuum. If a president is impeached, if William Ruto is impeached today, there is no way that office will exist in silence, in vacuum, without anybody, as a vacancy, without anybody running it. And that is why we are saying in this point that immediately that happens, a new president is sworn in, and that is the deputy president at that time serving. So point number 6, the political numbers that are required to impeach a president. I want to say at this point that it is not easy to impeach a president. It would require, some would say, impossible numbers in Parliament and in the Senate to impeach a president, but What are the numbers that are required, therefore? 233 MPs are required to vote to impeach a president. Remember, our parliament has 390 members of parliament, so 233 would require to vote yes to impeach a president. When it goes to the higher house, the bicameral, because it's a bicameral system, if it goes to Senate, it would require 45 senators to elect to impeach a president. So the practical Kenyan reality, because Kenya operates through coalition politics, because Kenya does not have a singular one majority party, a successful impeachment would require significant ruling coalition defections, elite political rupture, broad parliamentary consensus, and if these are the issues, if coalitions sit and agree to remove their leader, then it would require that members across the aisle to put together these numbers so that 233 is achieved. It will require a lot of consensus building, a lot of agreements, a lot of discussions, so that all the members of parliament can be on board to achieve this magic number of 233. A comparative example is this. Clinton survived due to party support. At that time, his Democratic Party was the majority in both, in Senate, and that is what elected to save him. In the case of Brazil, Rousseff fell after her coalition collapsed, and that is the likely scenario that would happen in this country if it came to that. A coalition would collapse, the broad-based government would collapse, and if that were to happen, and these members of parliament are dissatisfied, they could come together, coalesce, and impeach the president. So what is the strategic insight of this point? That in Kenya, impeachment is constrained more by parliamentary arithmetic than by law. It means, therefore, that those members of parliament who support the president, if that support fell out, then an impeachment will be successful. You will realize, or you will remember, when this president was elected, he had a minority in parliament. His UDA party did not get the majority of the members of parliament that were voted at that time. And what this president did in the beginning, in the early days of his presidency, he coalesced and formed a coalition in parliament of smaller parties that later on gave him a majority in parliament. He was a smart president. That was the first thing that he did. Many people say that he bought these members of parliament, that they were brought together and they were convinced that they were given some money and their support was bought. I don't know if that is true, but regardless of that or the issue that may be, that was extreme political wisdom, because what he did in the first days of his presidency, I'm repeating again, is that he coalesced, he picked members of parliament from other parties that were not his majority party, or not majority party, or his party that put him into the presidency, and he compelled them to give him support so that some of the bills that he was proposing would pass in parliament. For example, the financial inclusion the bill which brought Hustler Fund, and some of these other controversial laws or bills that have gone into parliament, including the Affordable Housing Act, the change from NHIF to SHA. It required that this president coalesces his support in parliament by getting the support of other members of parliament who were from minority parties to support the ruling party, or rather UDA, which is the party of the president. Therefore, point number 7. What are the national stability risks in the wake of the impeachment of a president? 1. The presidential impeachment would immediately test the following: Parliament, Senate, security institutions, markets, public trust, the economy, the shilling volatility, investor uncertainty, borrowing pressure, social risks. These, among others, are the main issues that will be affected in the wake of the impeachment of a president. The markets would react, the shilling would drop, there would be security issues, There are people where the president comes from and who really support him. So in the wake of an impeachment, some people will not be happy. Like I've said, the president is the symbol of national unity. In the wake of an impeachment, that unity would crumble, and a lot of things would happen. And as an example, the Kenya 2007-2008 political crisis, the post-election violence at that time, clearly demonstrated how political instability can escalate in a few days to cause upheaval and turmoil in the whole nation. So the impeachment of a president, sometimes it is necessary, sometimes it is good, sometimes it is important, but it is not wise always. Why? Because it tears apart the symbol, the unity of a nation. It tears apart the economy of a nation. The shilling would react, the markets would react, and there would be a negative outlook if this was to happen. However, we are not saying that presidents use this to become rogue. No. What we are saying is that in as much as impeachment is a good check for a president, at times it is not wise. And that is why we urge our president to please at all times lead using the Constitution, govern using laws and principles, and be what a president is supposed to be. Let him not just occupy that office for selfish needs. Let him not occupy that office because he's occupying it, but there's a lot of heavy responsibility for a president to run a nation. All right? So it is important for our president, President William Ruto, to listen to the people, to discern what is being talked about. Because if an impeachment was to happen and the office of the president fell vacant, then this nation would absolutely crumble, and it would take a bit of time to get it back. So point number 8, and the last point on this episode of the Bounce Back podcast. Remember, this is the Bounce Back podcast by Robert. I'm your host, Robert Onyari, and today we are discussing presidential impeachment. You will remember in our white paper, we also discussed presidential impeachment in our white paper that came out on Thursday. And today, on this podcast, we are talking about the impeachment of a president and what would happen in Kenya from a governance perspective. So future scenarios for Kenya. Scenario number 1, a stable coalition. The probability of a stable coalition in the future to stem impeachment is quite highly possible. We live in a country where to gain a majority as the ruling party is becoming more and more difficult, a bit more impossible. So a stable coalition would keep away impeachment. Number 2, coalition fragmentation is also possible in this country, and though the probability is moderate, the impeachment would be possible at that juncture. Number 3, a national crisis would force an impeachment. If, for example, the president has not handled a certain national crisis in a manner fitting the wisdom of a presidency, then an impeachment would happen. For example, if he mishandles the COVID-19, or he mishandles a domestic conflict, a foreign conflict, or he mishandles the economy, or he does something that as Kenyans we feel that this president has to go, then that president would go in that scenario. So the Constitution really provides for scenarios that can cause a president to be impeached, and we've talked about them, we've canvassed many of them in the course of the discussion of this podcast today. And in closing, and the final issue is, what is the bigger governance test? What is the advice that I would like to give as I sign off on this podcast today on the issue of impeachment? The country has constitutional maturity. We have one of the most progressive constitutions in the world, and because of that, the impeachment is not simply about removing a leader. It tests constitutional maturity. It tests institutional independence, that is parliament, because the president runs the executive and parliamentarians run parliament. So it tests institutional independence, that can parliament avoid executive capture enough to have a president be impeached successfully. It also fosters political discipline. If a president knows that the seat he occupies is executive, yes, but it is not permanent, then it would force this president to be politically disciplined and run the government in a manner that fits a useful and a wise president. Economic resilience is also another point. To avoid impeachment, or rather to impeach, is to cause economic turmoil. But if the country is at peace, if the president is of goodwill, if things are running as the way they are supposed to be, then you keep away impeachment and the economy remains strong. Also, the same applies to public order and security. The president being the commander-in-chief of the defense forces, the president being the symbol of national unity, the president being the cohesive glue that keeps Kenyans together. A country remains secure when its president is responsible, when its president is wise, when its president is thinking about Kenyans and is patriotic. When that happens, then an impeachment would be hard to happen. What is the final closing on this Bounce Back podcast today, this singular narration, the monologue, my discussion with you today? What are we saying in closing? A constitution can define how power is removed, but only institutions, political discipline, and national maturity determine whether that removal strengthens democracy or fractures the nation. Again, a constitution can define how power is removed, but only institutions, political discipline, and national maturity determine whether that removal strengthens democracy or fractures the nation. Ladies and gentlemen, impeachment is important to shape or to remove a belligerent or a president gone rogue. But the constitution of our country gives us the guidelines that require this president to be checked and to have checks and balances. That by the time we are impeaching, we've tried every other remedy that would have been important before we impeach. Also, institutions and their independence is also important. Remember, our constitution provides that the president is the holder of executive office, fine. But it is parliament, another arm of government that is supported by the doctrine of separation of powers. It is parliament that ultimately impeaches a president. Also, the judiciary has a role to play. I have not discussed much about that because I am not a lawyer and I don't know those issues so much. But a constitutional court can be set up. The Supreme Court could hear an impeachment case and it could determine whether the president goes or remains. So in this doctrine of separation of powers, the executive is checked by parliament, and both parliament and the executive are checked by the judiciary. So it is important to note that all these arms work in a symbiotic relationship. The executive funds parliament and the judiciary and parliament check the presidency or the executive. So in this scenario, an impeachment would be supported, would be made possible if indeed there is a clear separation guideline of powers by the three arms of government, such that a president cannot exist in a vacuum. It is very hard if this country, based on our constitution, it is very hard for the president to have executive power and authority of even dictatorship. And that is why we are saying impeachment is easy if the Kenyans feel that the president is not good enough, that this president has to go, that this president, we have had enough, and that is why impeachment happens. Remember, this is the Bounce Back podcast by Robert. I am your host, Robert Onyari, a policy, strategy, development, and governance expert at Sibia, Rufuos, Africa. And today, we were discussing the unlikely or likely impeachment of President William Ruto. If it was to happen, what would happen? How would it happen? And we've delved on it, we've seen it, and I think we've canvassed it, and exhausted it. Therefore, for further comments, please like, share, subscribe on our YouTube channel, that is at On Roberts on YouTube or at On Roberts on Spotify. This is the Bounce Back podcast. Today, Saturday, the 2nd date of May, till we meet again on the 9th, next Saturday. This is your host again, Robert Onyari, and this was the Bounce Back podcast by Robert. Thank you very much. Have yourself a wonderful weekend and week ahead. Asante sana.